I spent 25 years making a Tundra zoo in Planet Zoo, so let's get into it. The load screen I got was very on theme for this video, and I found that quite amusing. I started with making the zoo in question on hard mode, of course. My truly inspired naming skills were on full display, and when I created my zoo, I got the achievement for opening a zoo in every continent, which was actually the last achievement I could get that wasn't a career mode achievement. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that I chose the sculpted terrain. And I'm not really sure why, because I didn't particularly enjoy it last time. Surprisingly enough, though, it ended up working out pretty nice in the end. Also, it had been at least 3 months since I last played, so I was a little out of practice, and the blinding white snow wasn't helping. I did manage to get my starting path in place along with the staff buildings, after which I hired my staff and bought the first animal I'll be adding to the zoo, which is going to be the Arctic fox. So after checking how big the habitat needed to be, I went about placing the path. This is also my favorite technique, by the way. If you want to round out the path, you can just place a path in the corner and delete it. It also works for smoothing out weird bumps along paths in a more general sense, not just corners. Either way, though, after I was happy with my path, I set up the barrier and had the Arctic foxes brought to the habitat. I was going to add the shelter first, but when I couldn't make a decision on what to use, I added these trees instead. I'm not really sure how I was expecting that to help, but it must have, because shortly after I settled on using this purple stained wood, which I lined up with the viewing areas and added wooden logs as support beams, after which I finally came to my senses and changed the chain barrier to one-way glass, which looked a lot better in my opinion. I was waiting for the rest of the foxes to be brought to the habitat when I decided to add the donation bins really quick because there were a good amount of guests already at the zoo, after which I added a tiny hill in the middle of the habitat, which wasn't super noticeable, but I didn't want to just leave it completely flat. I added the enrichment items and sunk the ground on the corner to give them a water source, along with scattering more plants around the habitat. After I was done adding plants, it was time for the rocks. I placed 2 large rock clusters before pausing to watch this fox dive headfirst into the snow. Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that's wonderful. After which I spruced up the water area with some smaller rocks and played with the terrain. Not that you can really tell I did anything with all the snow, but that was the Arctic fox habitat done. I tasked the vet with researching the Arctic fox, after which I played with the time of day and changed it so that it wouldn't get dark, along with placing benches and trash cans along the path. And then I got the idea that I didn't just want to place down shops like I usually would. At least not long term, because I did place some food and drink shops along the path how I typically would. But that was just while I made the building that I wanted all the shops to go into. I even added a door, which I typically avoid, because doors in Planet Zoo tend to upset me. But this one actually did what I wanted it to. And I decided the building was done enough to add the shops. And so I moved it to where I wanted it, after which I needed to add the paths to connect everything, which in theory sounds easy, but in execution is a touch more difficult than what you might think or that I had planned for. I had originally wanted to fill the square entirely with path, but I settled with at least most of it being path. A really janky path, but a path nonetheless. And with the path in place, I added the roof and set up benches and trash cans inside. And if you look through the window, ignoring the janky path, it actually looks kinda neat. I finished off the inside by adding hanging lights and a heater, before finishing off the outside of the shopping building by adding planter boxes under all the windows. The next thing I wanted to work on was adding the only exhibit animal to this zoo, which was the old world swallowtail. And I was pretty excited about it because I hadn't had a chance to make a walkthrough exhibit since they were added to the game. I chose to place the exhibit outside the shop building, which was a mistake. The shops became a high traffic area and the path inside the walkthrough exhibit is very thin, which made for quite the traffic jam of guests later on. But for now I added what butterflies I had into the exhibit, and took a second to appreciate the neat little stripe that runs down their back. Oh, I love it. After which I placed these mulch patches along the edges, before changing the path to this wooden one, which I thought matched the aesthetic a little better, and going in with some foliage of my own to spruce it up a little bit, topping it off with adding some donation bins. And that was the Old World Swallowtail exhibit finished. Also, while I was letting the game run and doing some things around the zoo, I unlocked the first round of enrichment for the swallowtails, which I added and then had to rearrange some of the bushes I had placed in. I also made the big brain decision to add heaters along the paths in the zoo, which is something you'll see me adding to throughout the whole video. But in the meantime, I was ready to add the next habitat, which is going to be for the Arctic wolf. I was initially going to place the habitat next to the Old World swallowtails, but after reworking the barrier several times, I was struggling to get a satisfactory result, and the one I was happy with came out too small. Okay, that's about half the size I needed. So I deleted it all and decided to build next to the Arctic foxes instead, because that area had a lot more open, flat space. And I was able to make a barrier I was quite happy with. I was really happy with the front section of the barrier, but then I got to the back, and ooh, I placed so many rocks. That's shaping up. It's looking, well, it needs shaping. I used a combination of the ice rocks and the tundra rocks to cover all the knoll barrier lining the back. And I went back and checked because I wanted to know how much money I spent on this rock wall. And when I started making it, I had just a little over 57k. And the money really started draining when I started copying clusters of rocks to really bulk out the wall. And I only stopped placing rocks because I ran out of money and was left with just a little over $200. I did go back through and delete some of the rocks that were hidden under the ground, which gave me a touch over 9k back. So altogether, I spent over 40k on the Great Rock Wall, and honestly, I have no regrets. I'll stop talking about rocks now though, because the next step was to add the wolves into the habitat, after which I lined the viewing area with donation bins and made their shelter, before I went about adding a water area in the corner, which gave me quite a bit of trouble, because I was having an issue with getting the edges to look neat, and I think it always just looks like that maybe. I just never notice it because I don't normally make zoos in snowy biomes. I got it as smooth as I could before turning my attention back to the shelter, because I thought it looked a little unfinished. So I used this pillar rock thing to cap off the edges of walls, which didn't really make too much of a notable change, but I liked it more. I placed down some enrichment items, which included this rubber ducky, and a large snowball, which I found very amusing. After the enrichment, I added some greenery, and initially I only had the tundra biome selected, which gave me a selection of exactly 0 trees. So I went about placing a variety of bushes around the habitat. Also, while I was working on that, the vets finished up more research, and I was able to add more enrichment to the butterfly exhibit, which consisted of these really cute plants. But back to the Arctic wolf habitat. I want to put trees in here. I decided that not having trees wasn't going to work for me, so I let the game filter in the taiga plants, and chose to use some aspen and fir pine trees around the habitat. I eventually want to make a zoo for all the biomes in Planet Zoo, which includes a taiga zoo, and because the tundra and taiga animalist have some crossover, I didn't want to use too many plants from the taiga biome in the tundra zoo, and vice versa, so that when I do go and make a taiga zoo, it won't look too similar to the tundra zoo, despite sharing some animals. I was willing to put that aside in this case, though, because I thought trees would make this habitat look better. After I had the trees added where I wanted them, I toggled off the taiga filter and finished adding the greenery, which I think came out looking rather nice. And with the exception of coming back later to add rocks, this habitat was done. Oh wait, I haven't seen this for like a day and I love it. This is great. I think I wasn't so sure about it when I logged off yesterday, but no, this is great. I like this. This looks plain. But I really like this. Also, the butterflies are the backbone of this zoo. I turned on the management page and made it so that 30 of each can be in there at any given time. So as they pass, the slots would just fill up again. And they also reproduced very quickly and sold for a really good amount of cash. They're probably one of my favorite exhibit animals now. Neat and profitable butterflies aside, though, I went about adding walls and a roof to the staff buildings and the restroom. And personally, I think this might be the best looking staff area I've ever made. Normally I just make a big box around it all, but I really like the shape and look of these buildings. I worked more on lining the paths with heaters. I was also kind of particular with how I placed them, doing my best to keep them in the center of the path. The last round of enrichment items for the Old World Swallowtail was done, so I was able to finish their exhibit. After which, while I was watching my guards stop a crime from taking place, it started to rain, which was confusing. But even more confusing was that all the snow melted, which isn't a big deal. I just assumed that the snow was a permanent fixture to this zoo, and I had to go through the wolf and the fox habitats to fix their terrain needs. The rain did eventually turn back to snow while I was deciding what animal to add to the zoo next, which I decided was going to be the Dall sheep. I made a wood barrier on the back side of the shops area, with null barriers along the side and back and glass in the front. I covered the null barrier with rock clusters copied from the Arctic wolf habitat, after which I had the sheep brought to the habitat. I added a feeder along with the food enrichment items. I worked on the terrain next, making most of the raised terrain stone, and blended it in better with the rest of the habitat using soil and grass. I added the rest of their enrichment and gave them a water source, and was a little disappointed to see that there were no trees again. I thought about adding taiga trees to this habitat, but decided not to. I was going for more of a mountain vibe with this habitat and thought it might look fine without trees. I added bushes and flowers in the middle area of the habitat, along with scattering these moss patch things around. I set up donation bins along the viewing area, before going through and adding education speakers in front of the habitat, and that was the Dall sheep habitat done. Also, I come back through these habitats and add small rocks at some point. I just hadn't felt like making the small rock cluster just yet. Also, I did something for the first time in Planet Zoo and actually upped the food quality. I typically don't because it doesn't really have any major impact. Not that it doesn't do anything, it can increase the animal welfare some, which I typically don't have issue with, so I never really bother. But it was something new and fun to accomplish with this zoo, so I did it anyway. I didn't wait long to hop into making the next habitat, which is going to be for the red-crowned crane, and after going through many renditions of this habitat barrier, I settled on this rectangular hedge barrier look, after which I had the cranes brought to the habitat. I started with covering the habitat with the soil terrain and adding a water source, which took several attempts, but I eventually got something I was happy with. I made the shelter, which I added one-way glass in front of, in my effort to keep the stressed-out animal notifications to a minimum. My next step was to add plants, and these guys had tundra, taiga, temperate, and aquatic biomes in their ideal plant range category. And while I wasn't trying to use the taiga plants, the rest were fair game, because I feel like it'll take more than a few plants to make a temperate or aquatic zoo look too similar to my tundra zoo, and this left me with a lot more plant variety for this habitat. I started with adding my beloved cherry blossom trees. I filled the water with plants before trying to figure out what I wanted to do with this small back wall, because it was far too plain to stay how it was, but no matter how many plants I added, I just couldn't make it look good, which is weird because that normally works for me. And so I switched gears and added some more trees to the habitat, during which I had the idea to use rocks instead, which I thought looked a lot better than what it was. I sprinkled some leaf litter around the trees and added some blue lotus plants around the water. I was adding the enrichment items when I noticed the shelter requirement was rather low, so I copied the shelter to the other side, which isn't really something that I wanted to do, but it actually looked nicer with the second habitat there, so I wasn't mad about it. And with all that done, it was rock time. I added quite a lot of rocks to this habitat because I thought it looked rather plain. This is also where I finally made a set of little pebble rocks, which I added around most of the habitat. After all the rocks were added, I decided that the hedge barrier looked really out of place, and so I changed it to a wood barrier, which I think looked a lot better. And with that, this habitat was finished. Is this a battle? No, this is sex. I jumped straight into preparing to make the next habitat, which is going to be for the Eurasian lynx, which include trying to map out somewhere to actually set up the barrier, because I had used up most of the flat space and needed to start expanding the zoo up the hill. I found a spot that would work and made a null barrier with glass along the path, after which I copied a cluster of rocks and started building the walls, pausing briefly to change the side barriers to wood. Before I had the lynx brought to the habitat, I set up another staff area, because I didn't want to wait for the keepers to run across the whole zoo to bring the lynx to the habitat. I started with adding a small water source to the habitat, and then I tried to make a shelter out of rocks, but it just didn't look very good. But before I had a chance to delete it, I noticed all the escapable points throughout the habitat, so I climb-proofed the barrier walls. I also decided to change the null barrier to wood. I don't really know if it looked better, but I was able to climb-proof the whole barrier now, so I wasn't too bothered by it. And with the barrier now escape-proof, I finally deleted the rock shelter, and made one that didn't look so goofy. Speaking of goofy, the first baby crane was born, and I was just rather amused by how goofy its little wings looked. Back at the lynx habitat, I worked on the terrain, after which I pulled out the plants. I added a sparse amount of trees to this habitat before going through and adding a variety of bushes. along with more of the weird moss rock patch things. I don't think they're supposed to be rocks, but they do make a very rock-like sound when you place them. Actually, never mind. I just looked it up and it was referred to as a rock garden plant. I know it sounded very rock-like. Either way though, I placed those in the habitat, after which I sunk bushes into them because they stood out too much and I wanted them to blend in more. And then I did a similar thing to the rocks along the barrier. I added the enrichment items and set up donation bins and education speakers. I also added education speakers to the crane habitat because I had forgotten to do that earlier. After which I made my way back to the lynx habitat with a cluster of rocks to spread around, placing most around the water along with some placed around the barrier. And with the rocks in place, this habitat was done. I also remembered that the DLCs add new mechanic research stuff to the game, so I got that going. And this is where I logged off for the day. And when I logged back in, one of the lynxes had made their way outside of the habitat, which makes the work I did to escape-proof the habitat look like a joke. I think what actually happened is that I didn't account for them being able to jump onto the shelter, so I moved the rocks lower so they couldn't jump out anymore and waited for the vet to come collect the missing lynx. And when she did make it to the lynx, she just stared at him until I paid the fine to box him myself. And even after he was brought back to the habitat, my struggles were far from over, because the next animal I wanted to add to the zoo was the gray seal. So after buying the seals I wanted and spending some time managing the zoo, I set to making their habitat. And my goal was to make part of the underwater area visible from the path, which in concept sounds simple. You have part of the path raised, and you have part of it lower. And I don't even think this was a struggle for me because of the game mechanics. I just could not take the simple steps from my brain and actually put them into the game. So after the first few weird rectangular barriers I made, I got to this round design, which is really close to the end product, but not quite there. So after 25 minutes of messing with this barrier, I deleted all of it and smoothed the terrain and took a break. And when I came back, I had finally thought through how to get the effect I was trying to achieve. I started with raising some of the terrain, after which I added a glass barrier around it and added the water. I messed with the path quite a bit because it was kind of a struggle to make it look neat, but after all that, I had the gray seals brought to the habitat. I had to smooth the terrain down some because they couldn't actually access the water. I also made the bottom of the water more textured so that it would look nicer. And these guys don't require any hard shelter, so I wasn't going to be adding any. Instead, I jumped straight into the terrain painting, after which I watched them belly bounce to the water, which was very amusing. I was disappointed that you couldn't see the seals better in the water, so I clicked through the color options, my favorite being the bright pink and neon orange options. But I settled for the crystal option so that the water was as transparent as possible. I added all the enrichment to the habitat, which included this delightful submarine toy. I added some greenery to the water, which already exceeded their coverage needs. So I decided to see what adding rocks would look like before I added any more plants. And with the rocks added, it looked a lot fuller and not so plain. So I moved on to working on the terrain. But these guys really only like sand, so I probably didn't need to bother touching the terrain. I also deleted the water before re-adding it, so that's why it's not clear anymore. I fix it eventually, but not before I decided to add some plants to the land area because it looked too plain. I added some donation bins around the habitat, after which I noticed a gathering happening on the shore. I had absolutely no idea as to what they were doing, so I went back to what I was doing and placed down education speakers. Also, I finally made the water clear again, and that was this habitat done. What a struggle. Also, I learned that changing the food quality makes the food look cooler. And if I had known that before now, I would have been doing it the whole time. Look, there's like a watermelon in there, that looks like a bell pepper, a carrot, and that looks like a cut up banana maybe. That's neat and I like it. Also, I had to make my way back to the seals to add heaters to their habitat, because they're not big fans of the snow. After adding heaters to the seal habitat, I then spent some time adding heaters to the human habitat, otherwise known as the path throughout the zoo. I did put a pause to my heaters to check out the new baby seal, though. Oh, where did you come from? Which did this little roll thing, and if you ignore the flipper clipping through the neck, it was really cute. And we are now going to get into making my second, or maybe even my first favorite habitat. I haven't really decided yet, but either way, it is one of my favorite habitats that I made in this zoo, and it is for the grizzly bear. But before I could start that, I needed to take a trip back to the 100-year zoo to collect my albino grizzly bear, because I wasn't going to squander the opportunity to add her to a zoo. Once back in the Tundra Zoo, I went about making the path for the habitat, after which I set up a wood and glass barrier, and copied some rocks to line the back of the habitat with. After placing many rocks, I chose a spot to add the water and made a waterfall above that. And with all that in place, I had the grizzlies brought to the habitat. I used these wood pieces to make them a shelter, which I decorated with these stars and what was supposed to be a lamppost. Oh, it's on fire. Don't be on fire. But instead I used it as a really cool looking support beam, and with the color change to black, the flame isn't even visible anymore. I found this little wall torch thing that I mirrored on either side of the shelter, after which I finished it off with more beams, which I left sticking out the top because I thought it looked cooler than sinking them in wood. I added the bedding and enrichment to the habitat. I started with placing these big yellow trees, but they weren't something the grizzlies liked, which honestly worked for me because they didn't look good in the habitat anyway. And instead I used these birch trees, which better fit the aesthetic of this habitat. I used this red bush thing to decorate the rocks and the top of the shelter. After decorating the water, I spread a variety of bushes and flowers around the rest of the habitat. And after fixing the terrain to their liking, this habitat was done. At least for now. I decided it was finally time to add small rock clusters to the habitats throughout the zoo. And for some reason, instead of starting with the habitat I was currently working on, I started with the seals. And after I added small rocks to the seal habitat, I also went through with more big rocks, which left this habitat looking a ton better than what it did. I also added small rocks to the sheep and wolf habitats, before I finally made my way full circle and added small rocks to the grizzly bear habitat. I'd also forgotten to add donation bins and education speakers to the habitat, so I went about doing that, and now this habitat was actually finished. I went about adding a new shopping area using the same style as the last one, set off to either side of the crane and the seal habitat. I added the same windows and planter boxes. It was almost exactly like the other one, but this time I had a little fun decorating the inside of the building. And with the new shopping area added, I was ready to jump into making the next habitat, which was going to be for the Highland cattle, since I had pretty much just been going down the list of tundra animals. But I decided to switch it up and make the moose habitat next. So I made a path trailing off the grizzly bear habitat and set up a wood and glass barrier before having the moose brought to the habitat. And while I was waiting for them to arrive, I had the idea to add their water, but I put it in the corner where there would be a view under the water. And this would have been a cool idea if I had put an aquatic or even a semi-aquatic animal in this habitat, but I really don't think the moose are going to get up to any deep diving shenanigans, at least not in Planet Zoo. I know they're adept swimmers in real life, and apparently they're really good at diving too, which is a little beyond me because I don't know what business a moose has in the water. But moose are absolute units, so I'm not about to tell them what they can and can't do. I lined the back of the habitat with rocks, slowly tapering them down as I got further from the corner, after which I went through the process of making many different shelters. My issue was that the rocks along the barrier were too low to make the shelter I had initially wanted. And you might think that the easy solution would be to just make the rocks taller so that I could make the shelter I wanted. And you know what they say, great minds think alike. I had the exact same thought after 20 minutes. After raising the rocks and finishing the shelter, I put some rocks along the top to make it seem more connected, after which I added the enrichment items and pulled out the plants. I started with sinking bushes into the rocks, before placing a few bushes around the habitat, along with more of those weird moss rock things. And then it was time to add small rocks around the habitat, focusing them mostly in and around the water, along with the barrier edge. After I worked on the train, I added education speakers and donation bins, and that's where I thought I was going to leave this habitat, but the middle area was just too empty for my taste, so I went back through and added some more trees and bushes, along with reworking the train a little bit more, and then this habitat was actually done. I set up another shopping area off to the side of the moose habitat. I didn't make a bigger building around this one though, but I did decorate the shops, and I think they came out rather nice. I spent some time placing more heaters along my path, along with just maintaining the zoo. Nothing really of note happened in that time, other than when I decided that the side of the moose habitat was too plain, so I put another cluster of rocks along the barrier. And I'm not really sure if it elevated the look at all, but at least it wasn't too plain anymore. I really was done with the moose habitat now though. I don't add anything else. I moved on to adding the next animal to the zoo, which is going to be the Highland cattle. I wanted this habitat to be really big, and it was also going to be a walkthrough habitat, but with a little extra, because there's this interactive walkthrough habitat thing now, or whatever it's called. I also got kind of crazy with it, and instead of my normal wood and glass barrier, I used the steel mesh barrier. which I always thought was ugly, no offense if you like that barrier, but I think for this habitat it works better because it's less visible than what the wood barrier would be, and I think it looks weird when you zoom out and see a large wood wall stretching across the zoo. So I've been enlightened and I can now see why this barrier might come in handy every once in a while. After adding the path, I had them bring the cows to the habitat, and after the first few had arrived, I worked on making the terrain more to their liking. I added water sources throughout and also placed some of the enrichment items before going about making them a shelter, which I was rather happy with the outcome of. I placed the bedding and pulled out the foliage, starting with the trees, before moving on to the bushes. I used this taller tree-like bush because this habitat was way too big to just rely on the smaller bushes to fill the space. I also added plenty of the smaller bushes though before I was satisfied with the amount of plants in this habitat, and then it was time for rocks. I started with adding them to the water before placing quite a lot of them along the side of the mountain. Maybe it's not a mountain, maybe it's just a tall hill. Either way though, I added a lot of rocks into the side of it, and then went back through and sunk bushes into some of those rocks, and this habitat was done. I didn't bother adding donation bins to this habitat because most of the guests aren't on the path. I guess I could have still added some at the start, but I really wasn't too worried about it. After finishing the Highland cattle habitat, I restocked the Arctic fox habitat because the last one passed away. It's kind of visceral that she died on top of the blood splatter. Moving past that though, I spent a short amount of time doing miscellaneous things, but I was really excited to start the next habitat because I had big plans for it. So I set up the barrier for what is going to be the Himalayan brown bear habitat and placed a huge cluster of rocks in the back before digging out the water area. And the goal for this habitat is to take all the stuff I really liked about the grizzly bear habitat, but make it bigger, which also involves placing a lot of rocks along the back barrier and making an even bigger and better waterfall for this habitat, after which I had them deliver the bears. I started making their shelter, setting up a wood frame to build off of, before I went in with rocks to make it look kind of like a cave. And I'm not really sure if it looks very cave-like, but I was happy with the final outcome either way. I placed down all the enrichment items, after which I pulled out the greenery. I used some of the bigger trees to cover up sections that I thought looked weird, before scattering some bushes around. I then went through and did the same bush sinking into rock ordeal, which always takes a while, but I think it adds something fun to the overall look. I fixed the terrain and added donation bins and education speakers, and this habitat was done. And I was quite pleased with myself. I felt like I had accomplished exactly what I set out to do, and I think it looked pretty good. And with another habitat done, it was time for some downtime. I placed more heaters and quite a few vending machines because I want that 5-star rating, and that's just not going to happen without more food and drink places to satisfy the guests. I also finished the staff area by the seal habitat, adding the same purple walls and red roof. And with that, I was ready to add some Wolverines to my zoo. I decided to place their habitat above the Dall sheep, which is a rather steep area, but Wolverines have a minimum climbing requirement, so I figured I could make it work. I initially made my typical half-glass, half-wood barrier, but I wasn't really feeling the wood barrier for this habitat, so I replaced it with no barriers and tried using rocks instead, which still wasn't really shaping up how I wanted. So I took a pause and had the Wolverines brought to the habitat, after which I picked out these flat rocks, which after quite a lot of finessing, I managed to make into a barrier I was happy with. I decided to use the flatten to foundation tool to make some flat areas that I could place their water and enrichment onto. I also made a shelter out of some copper roof pieces, which I placed below the water. Just the one didn't meet the shelter requirement though, so I copied it and placed another above the entrance door, after which I placed some climbing structures into the habitat. I also realized I didn't add a beam to the shelter, so I did that quickly. I also placed bedding underneath the shelter that sits below the water, after which I fixed up the terrain, starting with changing it all to short grass before going in with rock and soil. After all the terrain was in place, I pulled out the plants and started with adding trees to the unsightly corners. I did bushes throughout the habitat, which also included sinking them into the rock wall. Speaking of rocks, I pulled those out next and added them to the steep drop-offs to make them look better, along with adding them around and in the water. And after renaming the habitat and adding donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done. Not my favorite habitat I've ever made, but it was functional. Also, I don't know if I've ever mentioned, but I do rename the habitats. I just don't typically remember to do it right after finishing the habitat. Oh, and this has nothing to do with habitats, but I figured out how to turn off birth and death notifications for animals. So I switched off both for the old world swallowtails because every time they bred, it would clog up my timeline notifications. It's just the little bell at the top of the timeline tab if you wanted to know, because I have a feeling this isn't the last time I'm going to be using it. Also, I took a couple trips to the cheetah zoo to collect conservation credits, which I used to purchase the rest of the animals I'm going to need for this zoo. I'm also really tempted to remake a conservation credit zoo, because I want one that looks nicer and more aesthetic. I don't really know if I'm going to, though. What I am going to do, though, is add the next habitat to my Tundra zoo, which is going to be for the king penguin. And this habitat is going to go up by the Himalayan brown bear habitat, which probably wasn't the best place to put it, because it was rather disconnected from the rest of the zoo. But either way, I made a glass barrier with no barriers in the back, and went about adding the water and a path. After which I had the keepers bring the penguins to the habitat. I then went about covering the back with rocks. I also got an upward angle of the penguins swimming, and they kind of look headless, which I found very amusing. My first attempt to make a shelter was rather lackluster, so I deleted it and reworked the rock wall before making another shelter, which I also didn't like. So I changed tactics and made a half dome into the water, which I left a little hole in the middle of, which led into the water. And I thought it would be really cool if they used it to enter the water, but they never did, at least not that I saw. After doing some terrain smoothing, I made part of the path raised so that guests could view the penguins on land. And with a new layout to work with, I went back to trying to make a shelter for these guys. We're gonna skip through my many attempts and just get to the one I went with, which was this really cute glass house thing. Maybe house isn't the right word, but it is what I had in mind when making it. With the shelter done, I pulled out the greenery. I added these underwater plants before adding a few pieces to the land area. I changed all the terrain to sand because they really weren't big fans of grass. After which I looked at their environment tab, and their plant bar was a solid 0%. So despite liking how they looked, I did delete all the plants that were in the water, with the plan to add plenty of rocks in the water to make up for how plain it looked. I added the enrichment items, which included this duck that I put deep in the water so that I could watch it bounce up. And despite the penguins' hatred for grass, I did add a small amount just along the plants, after which it was time for rocks. I started with adding rocks to the water since that was where the majority of them were going to be. After I was done filling the water, I added some along the rock barrier. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done. I want to see someone use this so bad. Waddle this way. Charlie. Please. Don't just walk by. Go in, go in, go in. Charlie. I spent some time trying to get them to go into the tunnel I made, but they simply wouldn't, so I gave up. They did have some funny small-headed children though, so I suppose that makes up for not going through the cool tunnel that I made them. Are they fighting? After hanging out with the penguins for a bit, I moved on to adding the next habitat, which is going to be for the polar bears. I initially flattened the area between the lynx and the cranes, thinking that that was where I was going to put the polar bears, but the space wasn't nearly big enough, so I decided to save that spot for the red foxes later on, and instead set up a path behind the lynx habitat for the polar bears. I initially made the barrier out of steel mesh, but ended up switching it to glass so that I could place water at the edge. And then after placing the water, I changed it to thick glass because I was worried the polar bears would break the normal glass. And with the barrier set up how I wanted it to be, I had the polar bears brought to the habitat. I covered part of the barrier with rocks, which I used as the wall to the shelter, which was also rocks. I was worried about the guests complaining about not being able to see the polar bears, so I added 2 viewing domes to the habitat to hopefully avoid that. I then went back and added these thin rock pillars so that maybe the rock shelter thing didn't look like it was just floating there. I added the enrichment items and pulled out the greenery. I started with trees and continued on with bushes, which I also sunk into the rocks. And to finish off the greenery, I added flowers. I was working on the terrain when I noticed that they could escape the habitat, but it was actually a really easy fix. I just moved this tree a little bit backwards, and that seemed to do the trick. I finished the terrain and added donation bins and education speakers. And for a second, I thought I had finished this habitat, but then I noticed a distinct lack of rocks. So I added some to the sides of the hills and in the water. By the way, does it ever bother anyone that I'll grab a large cluster of rocks that cost a couple $100 to place, but then I'll have like 2 rocks barely poking out of the ground? In my defense, it's easier to grab a large cluster of rocks that looks different from all angles. Either way though, I finished placing all the rocks and this habitat was done. I didn't wait long to jump into the next habitat, which is going to be for the red foxes. And after a while of playing with what I wanted the path to look like, I eventually had a simple wood barrier set up. And after adding water to the edge, I had the foxes brought to the habitat. After they arrived at the habitat, I pulled up the rocks and started lining the inside of the cave shelter area. After which I placed down bedding and added the enrichment items, which included this bubble blower, which is probably my second favorite enrichment item. Not as great as the duck, but better than the submarine. I worked on the terrain before starting to add the plants. I kept the trees sparse because I didn't want to block the viewing areas. I placed bushes around the trees and sunk them into the rocks. I didn't scatter too many small rocks around this habitat, but I did throw some in and around the water, and just a few along the rock barrier. After which I placed the donation bins and education speakers, and this habitat was finished. A few of the foxes were getting stressed though, so after a little while I put up some quiet signs. And to my surprise, when I went back to the polar bears to see what the guests thought of the habitat, it was mostly positive, which was pleasant, because I was sure it was all going to be red frowny faces. And the inspector report I got wasn't too bad either. You can also see the crowd issue I had mentioned, but I didn't really have any idea of how to help the issue in that moment, so I just left it, and instead covered up some facilities that guests were complaining about being able to see. I also threw a couple of trees throughout the zoo for a little decoration. After which I set out to make the next habitat, which is going to be across from the penguins, and is going to house the reindeer. I set up a wood and glass barrier with a guest walk-through door, because like the Highland cattle, the guests can interact with the reindeer. Not that I really thought guests were gonna make it this far into the zoo, but putting the reindeer back here was my attempt to get more guests to come this far. I had the reindeer brought to the habitat. The first thing I wanted to add was the shelter, which was easier said than done, and in the end I just copied the grizzly bear shelter, which I told myself I would go back and change at some point, but I never did. I added rocks along the back barrier next, after which I gave them all their enrichment items and placed bedding underneath the shelter. I added just a little bit of greenery to this habitat before I fixed the terrain to their liking, and spread some smaller rocks around in the water, along with a few clusters around some of the greenery, and this habitat was done. This was definitely the most uninspired habitat I made in this zoo. I didn't even add donation bins, but to be fair, the penguin donation bins are right across the path, which is close enough for the guests. With that habitat done, I found myself back at the red fox habitat, adding one-way glass across their shelter, which I heavily considered adding when I initially made the habitat, but I was really hoping that they just wouldn't get stressed. Also, I came back around to the overcrowding issue and chose to add another path off of the main one, which I also connected to the zoo entrance. Messing with the path like I did though caused quite a conundrum for a second. They were slowly getting themselves unstuck though, and so I went to see the new polar bear cub while they figured it out. And even though it wasn't intended, the guests had found themselves quite a cool viewing area of the underwater section. After doing a couple more miscellaneous zoo things, I went about making the path where the final habitat of this zoo will go, which is going to be for the Timberwolves. I sectioned out quite a large area with what was initially a wooden barrier, but I switched it to chain link because I thought it looked nicer. I considered changing part of the barrier to glass so that I could add water, but it wasn't really the look. So instead I lowered the terrain and added water that way. And I was really worried about the habitat being too steep all around, so I did quite a bit of terrain smoothing. After which I had the Timberwolves brought to the habitat, and then it started snowing, which was fine. But I had been trying to do the bulk of habitat building when it wasn't snowing, so that I could know the habitat would look nice when the snow stopped. I didn't want to pause my habitat making though, so I continued on, and hollowed out this little cave ordeal to act as the shelter, which I also placed bedding in, after which I added the enrichment items and scattered some trees, bushes, and flowers around. As an afterthought, I also placed rocks beneath the raised path, which I also sunk a whole lot of bushes into. I then collected a cluster of small rocks to spread underneath the water and along the edge of the barrier. I also added even more wolves in because I wanted to have as many wolves that I could be in the pack without them starting to fight, which also skewed the enrichment percentage, so I went back through and added more. And if I had thought the Arctic wolves were loud, they don't even compare to how noisy the Timberwolves are. This habitat wasn't entirely done, but it was as finished as it was going to be until the snow disappeared. In the meantime, there was an escaped baby polar bear, which was a little confusing.
How did you escape?
Because I was so sure that I had made the barrier escape-proof with my strategic tree placement. It wasn't actually that much of an issue though, because she eventually went back into the barrier and I was able to move her away from the area. And then I found something rather exciting. There were some melanistic fox cubs. I checked the parents to see if there was a history of color variation, but there wasn't any that I could find, so I thought that was rather neat. I spent quite some time getting B-roll footage of all the animals, which is something I would have typically done as I made the habitats, but I didn't do that this time around. There was also an incident with the seals. The incident being that one of them passed away.
Holy fucking shit. You know, most of them get like a little animation. This one just dropped dead.
And I was far too amused because instead of a death animation, she just stopped moving altogether. Moving past that though, I went through and added walls and a roof to any structure that didn't have any yet, and the snow eventually did melt, so I went back to the Timberwolf habitat and started adding the final touches, which started with fixing the terrain to be more suitable, after which I placed large rocks along the steep edges. I also threw a couple small rock clusters around before I went into the shelter area and lined it all with rocks. I'm not sure if it made it look finished or just cluttered and hectic, but either way I like the final look of it. And to finish off the habitat, I placed a few more small rocks, and this habitat was done. Except for the education speakers, but I don't get back around to that for a little bit. Also, the polar bear found her way to the top of the shelter again. I'd actually thought that she was glitching up here, but no, she was walking her way up there. I just didn't know it yet. And now that all the habitats were added to the zoo, I finally went through and finished placing heaters along the paths. The only paths I didn't add heaters to were the ones in habitats. I placed trees around the zoo to decorate it, before finally remembering to add education speakers to the Timberwolf habitat. I didn't bother with donation bins though, because I honestly don't think enough guests will be making their way this far into the zoo to really warrant placing them. I did go through and add animal talk stations to all the habitats though. Also, placing down those animal talk stations had gotten quite a nice group of people to the reindeer habitat, which made me quite happy. The way she threw the food also amused me quite a bit. Also, the path I had added to help with the crowding had done a halfways decent job. It was still crowded, but not quite so bad. Also, this is where I finally noticed that the baby polar bear could run past my tree. So I moved my tree and lowered a few of the rocks to hopefully prevent any more roof escapes. I went through and replenished the enrichment in the fox habitat, and I was also trying to finish all of the animal research before the end of the 25th year, which, spoiler alert, didn't end up happening, but it was really close. And at the very least, I had managed to switch all the animal food to the highest quality. Also, most of the seals had passed away, so I added a new batch to the habitat. The 25th year was almost over though, so I kind of figured they weren't going to be able to deliver them to the habitat before then. And I feel like it's only appropriate that at the end of the 25th year, the polar bear escaped again. I really should have named her, but I did literally just go and check as I'm writing this script, and there are polar bears under the taiga section, so if you have a name suggestion for her, I would love to see it in the comments. And when I add polar bears to the taiga zoo, I'll transfer her over. I didn't actually end right when the 26th year started, because I wanted all the seals to be brought to the habitat, and because I needed to empty my animal trading center, which took a minute because I had to build 2 new quarantine rooms. It did eventually get done though. But that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.